First up this evening is Nathan Stenzel. He's giving a talk titled Preambles to Politics, Comparing Reformed and Roman Catholic Views of Human Constitution. Nathan works as a teacher and a writer. He is both a graduate of and a graduate student in New St. Andrews College, where he is pursuing a master's in theology and letters. So please welcome Nathan.
Thank you. Glad to be speaking here tonight. My talk I titled Preambles to Politics. I needed a title that would justify my giving this talk at a political philosophy forum, even though it's going to be mostly theology. And the title gives me an out in case I don't get around to the politics part. So all I promise is preambles. So in this talk, I'm going to try and sketch out some differences between early modern Reformed and Roman Catholic views of man's condition prior to the fall. These two traditions have different and competing views of Adam's original righteousness, the righteousness which he lost at the fall. And the disagreement is this: was that original righteousness natural to Adam, as the Reformed maintain, or was it, as the Roman Catholics held, a supernatural gift of God's grace? So I'll conclude my talk by attempting to say a few suggestive things about what the possible political implications of these two views might be. But let's start with the Roman Catholic position. It's easiest to understand the Reformed position in light of what they're reacting against. So I'll start here. And the Roman Catholic position is basically as follows. God created man in a state of pure nature, where he was free from sin and where he had not yet received any gift of grace. Man is also, of course, a unity of soul and body. But even in that unfallen state, the soul and the body would naturally have been in conflict. Adam's desires of the flesh for corporeal and sensible goods, they would overwhelm his higher and his rational desires. This inordinate desire, the theologians call concupiscence. And for the Roman Catholic theologians, this was the natural state of unfallen man. For the Roman Catholic theologians of the time, concupiscence was not itself a sin. That which does not proceed from the will or from the intellect is not properly called a sin, or so they said. And thus, concupiscence, being no more than the disharmony of flesh and spirit, and not a voluntary act, it was not considered sin. So although concupiscence on the Roman Catholic account is not truly sin, they nonetheless recognized it as a weakness. It was a defect of man's condition. Robert Bellarmine, papist theologian from the 16th century, he says this, and remember he's talking about Adam's pre-fall condition. He says, "Man naturally is formed out of flesh and spirit. Thus, he shares his nature partly with beasts, partly with angels. By reason of his flesh and communion with beasts, he has an inclination towards corporeal and sensible goods, towards which he is carried by his senses and appetite. By reason of his spirit and communion with angels, he has an inclination towards spiritual and intellectual goods, towards which he is carried by his intellect and will. From these, diverse and contrary inclinations exist in a single man, a certain conflict. On account of this conflict, there is great difficulty in acting well, since one inclination impedes the other." Although this theology predated him, it had a fairly strong pedigree in Franciscan theology. Bellarmine became the whipping boy for Reformed theologians, and I assume you can hear why. From Turretin to Hodge to Bavinck, everybody takes Bellarmine to task for saying things like this about man's original state. And parenthetically, I don't think it's unfair to take Bellarmine as representative of the Roman Catholic position, at least during the early modern period. He held the chair of controversial theology at the Roman College. His job was to teach and defend the doctrine set forth by the Council of Trent. And his works, from which I'm quoting, they were accepted as premier defenses of those doctrines in the decades that followed. So, what was the solution to this defect in man's nature, this conflict between flesh and spirit? Well, as set forth by Bellarmine, the solution was the donum superadditum, the superadded gift. Adam, supposedly in his state of integrity, could have received this superadded gift of grace from God as a reward for an initial act of obedience. This, of course, has significant implications for your doctrine of salvation, merit, things like this. That would be an interesting discussion, but it's not my purpose here today. This superadded gift that he received was his original righteousness. Original righteousness. And it was this original righteousness that would have kept Adam's lower passions in check, in subjection to his higher intellect and will. Here's Bellarmine again. Divine providence at the beginning of creation, that he might remedy this disease or languor of human nature, which arises from man's material condition, added to man a remarkable gift, namely original righteousness, by which, as if by a golden bridle, the lower part to the higher part, and the higher part to God, might easily be kept in subjection. Here's one more quote from Bellarmine to drive the point home. He says, that integrity with which the first man was created, and without which, after his fall, all men are born, was not Adam's natural condition, but a supernatural elevation. So to sum up the Roman Catholic position, Adam was created in a state of pure nature without original righteousness. Adam was also, of course, a composition of flesh and spirit, and thus, although created in the image of God, his natural condition was one in which the lower passions were in constant conflict with his higher faculties and impeded him from fulfilling his natural end. To remedy this condition, God granted, or would have granted him, this supernatural gift of original righteousness by which the lower was subjected to the higher, and the whole man in his intellect, will, his appetites was subjected to God. The gift of original righteousness thus removed the impediments to Adam's fulfillment of his natural end, thus removed any impediment to his flourishing as a human being. Let me emphasize that on this Roman Catholic account, original righteousness was a supernatural gift. It was something given on account of a deficiency of man's natural powers. There's an asymmetry of man's natural powers and his natural ends here. Though the subordination of the lower appetites to the higher reason is a natural good for man, according to the Roman Catholic doctrine, even prior to Adam's fall, it would have only been attainable by supernatural grace, a gift superadded to man's natural constitution. Man's natural state, so they say, is one of concupiscence. He is plagued by disordered appetites. So what did the Reformed have to say to all of this? Well, as I alluded to earlier, there's a fairly strong consensus throughout the tradition and its various strains in rejecting this theology. Whether Swiss, English, or Dutch, the Reformed all rejected it. And this rejection was also carried forward into American Presbyterianism as well as Neo-Calvinism. Things get a bit confused with the Neo-Calvinists, but they still make an attempt at rejecting it. So the first point to which the Reformed object is the notion that concupiscence isn't truly sinful. The major confessions from all streams of the magisterial Reformation reject this. The 39 articles here are representative. It says, concupiscence and lust hath itself the nature of sin. The Westminster Confession also says, the first motions of sin, by which it means concupiscence, are truly and properly sin. Now, this wasn't just because the Reformed wanted to burden people's consciences unduly. No, claiming that concupiscence is not sinful, that is to say, that in the state of integrity, Adam's lower appetites were constantly at war with his higher faculties. To say so is to create a real theological problem. You've made God, in some way, the creator of evil, or so their objection ran. God has created a defective man. Francis Turretin, the great 17th century Reformed Orthodox theologian, he sums up the problem this way. He says, this cannot be said, that God has created a defective man. This cannot be said without ascribing the same to the author of nature, who consequently must be considered the author of sin. As he was the author of the material, he must be called the author of that defect which necessarily follows it. To this, Charles Hodge adds his own brusque four-word objection. Matter is not evil, he says. To say, as Bellarmine did, that the conflict between flesh and spirit arises from man's condition as a material being is to revive, as Hodge says, the Manichaean principle of the inherent evil of matter. So instead of positing a supernatural original righteousness that needed to be added above and beyond man's nature, making up for its natural defects, the Reformed insisted instead that original righteousness was natural. Here's Turretin again on original righteousness. Original righteousness was the rectitude and integrity which was created with man and bestowed upon him at his origin, embracing wisdom in the mind, holiness in the will, and rectitude and good order in the affections. It bespeaks such a harmony among all his faculties that the members obey the affections the will, and the will reason, and reason the divine law. And thus the man exists upright and innocent and without sin. Here's Franciscus Junius saying much the same. This principle in the creation, being right, holy, not contaminated by any stain of inordinate desires, the will followed the judgment of the intellect in such a way that under its guidance, mankind, in accordance with the order that is congruent to their nature and in an intelligent way, willed the ends and the objects shown by reason and performed them by acting. So you can hear certain similarities to the Roman Catholic position, especially in how it's said that original righteousness properly ordered all of man's faculties to each other, and those, in turn, were ordered to God. But the key difference is that for the Reformed, this was the natural condition of man. It wasn't a remedy for some defect in man's natural powers. Man, just as God had created him, was furnished with the qualities necessary to fulfill his natural end. And the other way the Reformed named this original righteousness was with the familiar language of the image of God. Now, take a bit of a diversion here, but I think it's necessary to clear up some confusion. It's common to hear the nature of the Reformed objection to this Roman Catholic position summed up something like this. Roman Catholics believe in a superadded gift of original righteousness, while the Reformed believe original righteousness is a concreated gift. This is true, actually, so far as it goes, but it's a bit reductive and risks obscuring the debate. Many of the Reformed are, in fact, happy to use the language of superadded gift, and even the language of pure nature that Bellarmine uses. They just mean something different by it. So if you pick up Junius, you're going to read him talking. You're going to see him talking about the state of pure nature and the superadded gift, things like this. But don't be confused. He means something different than the papists do. I'll talk about this more in a minute. The debate between the Reformed and the Roman Catholic is really whether original righteousness is natural or supernatural. So whereas the Roman Catholics maintained that Adam's original righteousness was supernatural, that it was a gift of grace, furnishing him with something beyond his natural powers. The Reformed insist instead that original righteousness was natural to Adam. It was not a gift superadded to his nature. It was a gift with which he was concreated. Remember that language from Turretin of it was there at the origin. It was born with Adam. So to sum up the Reformed position here, Adam was created already furnished with original righteousness, which they also called the image of God. Original righteousness was not a remedy superadded to make up for native defects in man's constitution. This original righteousness consisted of the perfect harmony of all his faculties, such that there was no impediment to Adam fulfilling his natural end in accord with his natural powers. And if I could be a bit glib, the Reformed position is simply what it says in Genesis, that all God's creation was good. It lacked nothing necessary to the fulfillment of its natural end. Now, I've used the word natural several times, many times, and in multiple different contexts, and I need to clarify the different ways in which I'm using it. First, what do I mean that according to the Reformed position, original righteousness was natural to man? I do not mean that it was natural in the sense that it constitutes the very nature of man, or even follows directly from his essential properties. Original righteousness is not in this sense intrinsic to man. It's not the sine qua non of his nature. And Turretin is quite forceful in rejecting this. He says, not one of our divines asserts that original righteousness is natural in this sense. How do we know this? How do we know that it's not natural in this sense? That it's not a constitutive part of man's nature? Well, because it could be lost, right? And in fact, it was lost at the fall. If original righteousness is intrinsic in the sense of constituting man's essence, man would either cease to be man after losing it at the fall. He's no longer human. He has lost something of the human nature. Or we would have to say that he retained his original righteousness at the fall if we don't want to say that he ceased to be man. And on the second option, saying that he retained his original righteousness, it seems like some sort of Pelagianism would follow, where he's able to fulfill the terms of the covenant of works without the aid of grace. We don't want to be Pelagians, if you were wondering. But in what sense was original righteousness natural? Because I'm maintaining that it was. Turretin here is helpful again. He gives a taxonomy of all the different ways in which you can say natural. And he says it was natural in that it was concreated or born together with Adam's nature and most deeply implanted in it, as well as agreeing with the nature and adorning and perfecting it. One way to think of this is by analogy to bodily health. Was bodily health natural to Adam? Of course it was. But it was not natural in the sense that it was constitutive of his nature. If he became ill, he still would have been human. It was a quality of his nature. It was not the nature itself. That's what I mean by saying original righteousness is natural. That's what the Reformed mean. Second, I've said that original righteousness corresponded to man's natural end. It was what suited him to fulfill that natural end, such that if he did not have it, there was some impediment to him fulfilling that natural end. What do I mean by natural end here? How am I using natural? Well, if you're familiar with broadly Aristotelian notions of happiness as man's highest end, this is a good place to slot those in. Man's natural end is his flourishing according to the faculties and powers with which God has furnished him. And among these would be things like marriage, procreation, the exercise of his intellect, civic life, and the natural knowledge of God. For the Reformed, this is in distinction from man's supernatural end, which is communion with the triune God and ultimately the beatific vision. These are above and beyond man's natural powers. And the ability to attain them is, in fact, a superadded gift of grace. This is where the Reformed do use the language of superadded gift, incidentally. And this gift of grace elevates man above his natural condition. So we're not talking about a defect of his natural condition. We're talking about a natural condition that has its own integrity, that corresponds to its own natural end. His supernatural end would have been an elevation above that, without implying any defect in his natural state. The easiest way to conceive of this is as two tiers of life. You can imagine two tiers. You have the natural and the supernatural, right? Adam was created with everything necessary for his natural flourishing. So marriage, the exercise of his intellect, civic life, even the natural knowledge of God. He was created with everything necessary for that. And his supernatural end, which would have been the beatific vision, seeing God in his essence, this required a supernatural gift of grace above his nature for its attainment. So those are the two main senses in which the Reformed held original righteousness to be natural. It's first the adornment and perfection of man's nature, created with it, not a later addition making up for some defect. And second, it furnishes man with the qualities necessary to reach his natural end, his human flourishing. Again, this is to be sharply distinguished from the Roman Catholics who held that original righteousness was a supernatural gift, superadded to remedy the defects of man's natural condition. So, what might this all have to do with politics? I don't know. I'm going to try to outline some possible implications, though. The Roman Catholic position, inasmuch as it holds Adam to be naturally deficient and lacking the requisite abilities to reach his natural end, implies a sort of native anti-sociability to man. He is, by nature, not suited for a particular part of his human flourishing, that is, social and civic life. He's not suited for this because of his innate concupiscence. Even though civic life is constitutive of his natural flourishing, he's not suited for this in the way that God has created him. Even prior to the fall, on this sort of Christian Aristotelian account, man as a social animal, he would have naturally formed communities that would have developed over time into civil societies. And on this sort of account, civil society would have required some authority to coordinate the community's collective actions. Bellarmine goes so far as to say that political authority is so natural and necessary to humankind that it cannot be removed without destroying nature itself. And later he continues, if human nature requires a social life, certainly it also requires a government and a ruler, as it is impossible that a multitude can last long unless there is somebody to hold it together and be in charge of the common good. As with each of us, if there were no soul holding together and unifying the parts and forces and conflicting elements out of which we are made, everything would immediately disintegrate. So let me be clear here that I'm not trying to draw a straight line of logical causality from Bellarmine's view of original righteousness and Adam's defective nature. Not trying to draw a straight line from there to his claims about the necessity of political authority. But I do want to suggest that if you believe that man, even pre-fall man, was a walking conflict between flesh and spirit, plagued by concupiscence that could only be remedied by grace, it's not surprising that you would also portray man's civic life as portrayed by these antisocial tendencies, needing some sort of directive power to rightly order him to the other members of the community. This also makes all politics to hang on grace. For man is naturally incapable of civic flourishing so long as his intellect and his will and affections remain in conflict. He needs supernatural grace. Consequently, the candidate to take up the mantle of political authority will be the man who has received the most grace from God. Or stated in the negative, the best candidate for political authority is the man least plagued by concupiscence. In other words, the saint, the celibate, the priest, the pope. Again, I want to be careful not to claim that this sort of view of politics comes directly from Bellarmine's position on original righteousness. He nowhere makes such a claim. However, I do believe they fit quite well together. It's not surprising to see them together. Of course, the view that man in his unfallen state would have needed some political authority to direct the community to the common good, it's not unique to Roman Catholics. There was more or less theological consensus on this view in the early modern period, and it was a consensus that had begun to develop already in the 13th century with the rediscovery of Aristotle's practical works. The Reformed Orthodox, they largely accepted this view, with some notable exceptions. The problem with this account, even in Reformed authors who reject Roman Catholic notions of man as naturally plagued by inordinate appetites, the problem is that it can still too easily sound as if the necessity for political authority arises out of some insuperable anti-sociability. In other words, even if it is affirmed that man's original righteousness, the proper ordering of his intellect, his will, his affections, even if it is affirmed that this is natural to him, is the need for political authority still answering to some moral defect in his constitution? Certainly this would be true after the fall. But what about before the fall? On such an account, it seems that political authority serves an analogous role that superadded grace serves in the Roman Catholic account. Political authority is there to remedy man's defects. Of course, it could be defended differently. The necessity of political authority could be grounded somewhere else. It could be framed as answering primarily to man's finitude, not his anti-sociability. As a finite creature, perhaps he lacks sufficient knowledge of the desires and the goals of other members of the community, thus necessitating some sort of centralized political authority that can, with quasi-omniscience of particulars, order all the community's members to the common good. And incidentally, Thomas Aquinas seems to imply something like this. He says that Adam, the putative ruler of his unfallen race, would have been omniscient, having been supernaturally given exhaustive theoretical knowledge of all natural things, for the purpose of, he says, instructing and governing his posterity, who would have lacked such knowledge. Again, however, that the knowledge necessary to wield political authority is a supernatural gift to Adam, this implies that political authority is itself, again, playing an analogous role to the superadded gift of original righteousness. It's a gracious gift making up for the natural defects of man's created state. Well, to survey the different accounts of man's pre-fall political life is well beyond the scope of this talk. Fortunately, Dr. McIntosh has done that already at this very forum a few years ago. I looked it up, it's on YouTube. So I'll refer you there for more. But whatever your judgment about those various accounts, whether in Thomas Aquinas, Samuel Rutherford Bellarmine, or Althusius, I submit that the question of man's original righteousness needs to be factored in. This needs to be a factor we take into account. Is our account implying some sort of defect in man's created nature, some sort of moral defect, or merely his finitude? Where are we grounding the necessity of political authority? And I think we need a work of theological imagination here. This is not something that many people have touched, thinking about how these views of original righteousness imply different visions of the naturalness of political society. So the question that must be asked is, if the Reformed Orthodox are right, if original righteousness is really a natural quality of unfallen man, what kind of politics might follow from that? Thank you.
Thank you for listening to this presentation from the George Buchanan Forum Conference. We have many more that you can check out at our website at tgbf.org. You can also find us on YouTube or on your favorite podcasting platform. In true free market fashion, we're entirely crowdfunded by the generous support of people like you. If you'd like to help our work, you can set up one-time or recurring donations at tgbf.org. The best way for others to hear about us is from their friends. So please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing our material. We greatly appreciate it.